Welcome to Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Joseph Addington and Harry Berger. We've got a great show today. We're going to be talking about Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to the White House yesterday, Wednesday. We are recording Thursday, a little after 1:30 p.m. And of course, everyone is worried that Netanyahu and Israel will disrupt U.S.-Iran negotiations and push Trump toward war. So we'll talk about the state of play on that story. And then we'll be talking about Cuba. Last week, Kurt Mills and I talked to the author Robert Wright on this podcast, and we said at the beginning that we were going to be talking about Cuba, which is very vulnerable and isolated right now and facing possible U.S. intervention of some kind. But we didn't have a chance to cover that, so we'll talk about it today. And Joseph Addington is our Latin America specialist, correspondent, so he's the perfect person to ask about that. And then if we have time, I'm going to ask a couple questions at the end about some other subjects, namely Jeffrey Epstein. A lot of Epstein files just dropped. I think literally like millions. People have been combing through them. It's probably going to take a while to actually report on all that stuff because people have to dig through them. But I'm just kind of curious to hear from Harry, especially what's new and revelatory in that latest document dump. And I might, if we have time, ask about AI. It seems like more people are freaking out about AI this week and last week than had been previously. So I want to kind of get a gut check from Joseph and Harry about that. But first, let's talk about Iran. Let's talk about Netanyahu's visit to the White House yesterday. I have been traveling internationally. I just got back in last night, so I've been really tuned out of the news much more than usual. I was at the Budapest Dialogue Forum in Hungary and had a pretty packed schedule. So Harry, what's been going on exactly? What did Netanyahu and Trump and Rubio discuss, and what did yesterday look like?
So Netanyahu obviously traveled here for his fifth visit since Trump entered the White House for his second term. I think it was their seventh time actually meeting. Trump has traveled to Israel, to Tel Aviv twice to meet with him. And this meeting seemed to be like the last one that we just had in December, which was to convince President Trump to basically abandon his negotiations with Tehran, which have been ongoing now for a few weeks, led by Steve Witkoff mainly, and Iran's foreign minister, which seem, by all accounts, to be going well. As Trump even says, we're getting a better deal from the Iranians now than was offered or on the table or that we maintained with JCPOA under Obama. And they came here for the purpose of scuttling the deal, the Israelis. That was the purpose of the visit in December and the purpose yesterday. And so Netanyahu released a statement, uh, I think, to Barak Ravid, who is, of course, the Israeli mouthpiece, a reliable one in the United States, former Unit 8200 intelligence officer. And Netanyahu told him that, we want not just a nuclear deal, but also to take away Iran's ballistic missiles and to get rid of their ballistic missile program, which, of course, is completely unreasonable, is not something that's on the table and something that Iran would never accept. No country would accept that, especially considering that that is the only mechanism that Iran has itself to defend itself against ballistic missile attacks by Israel, something that happened, I guess it was June 12th of last year. And so they remember that. And of course, they're not going to give up the one program that they have that will protect them from that sort of, aggression in the future.
I can imagine that Trump suspects that he can get more concessions on nuclear because maybe he didn't obliterate Iran's nuclear program, but he did substantially degrade it with our own strikes on Iran last year. And maybe he's imagining he could get some concessions on Iran's so-called proxies, although they're not really remotely controlled because the Iran-led axis of resistance has been also degraded, mostly by Israel over the past couple of years. But that will make it even more difficult to get concessions on ballistic missiles because, as you say, Harry, that's like the one deterrent that Iran still has. And I think what's being pushed is not necessarily that they get rid of the ballistic missile program entirely, but that they have range restrictions specifically so that these missiles cannot reach Israel. And as you said, that's just very unlikely that any regime, the Islamic Republic, I can't imagine agreeing to it, but I don't think any Iranian government of any kind could possibly agree to such a thing. So I agree with you there. But was this visit by Netanyahu successful? I mean, Trump said nothing definitive came out of it. There seemed to be some effort on Netanyahu's part before flying back to Israel to present a kind of united front to say, okay, we're gonna let Trump try to get a deal. We're skeptical that he'll be able to get one. We want no ballistic missiles or whatever, some sort of caps on their ballistic missiles for Iran. Um, but we'll kind of follow and wait to see what happens, even if we're skeptical. But how do you see the results of this meeting yesterday?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to emphasize something that you just said, which is that this ballistic missile threat, as it's called, referred to as the Israelis, they don't even pretend that it's a threat to the United States, that these missiles would reach the United States or that they're aimed and targeted at us. It's a threat, as Israel admits, to Israel. CBS News had this Israeli propaganda campaign over the weekend where they attempted to convince Americans that these ballistic missiles threaten U.S. servicemen in the region, which of course raises the question why we even have U.S. servicemen as these kind of at these sort of tripwire bases that are still lingering around in the Middle East in countries that we're supposedly not at war in. And we're told that that's the reason why we need to strike Iran. The entire propaganda campaign here, I think, is just incredibly lazy as compared to something that like the Iraq War or even the bombing attempt that we had, or the bombing campaign that we had in June, the lead up to it, where there was basically a 2 month long Israeli propaganda campaign that took place in the United States, laundered by America's corporate media to convince Americans that Iran was really, really close, months away, even weeks away from achieving a nuclear weapon, even though as U.S. intelligence has admitted for over a decade, they don't even have a nuclear weapons program. They have enrichment up to 60%, or at least that was the case at the time. But they had no actual nuclear weapons program. It was, by all accounts, a civilian nuclear program. The propaganda now, uh, I think it's much lazier. The question of whether or not we're going to go to war or if these negotiations will continue, if Netanyahu will get his way like he did in June, I think it all depends on one's interpretation of what even happened in June, because there was this idea that what Trump was saying in the lead up to our bombing campaign then was all a farce and was meant to uh, be this deliberate disinformation campaign to convince Iran that we were sincere, that we wanted to pursue negotiations with them, when in fact we had already predetermined to support another one of Israel's wars. That was a claim that was made by a lot on the left, and there's evidence for those claims. There's also evidence that our negotiations were sincere, and that
Trump himself has tried to make it seem like they were a ruse, right? Because I think he knows it makes him look weak if he wanted to get a deal and Israel disrupted that. I've always disagreed with my friends on the left and also conservative libertarians and people like Dave DeCamp and stuff at antiwar.com. I believe he fits in this category of people who see those negotiations as a farce or a ruse. I think maybe toward the very end, like right before, the day or two before Israel launched its surprise attack, maybe they became kind of a ruse, or at least Trump knew an Israeli attack was coming, and didn't reveal that and pretended that there was going to be negotiations coming that Friday. But I think most of the process, Trump was sincere and really wanted to get a deal, and that's why Israel acted to disrupt it. Um, I kind of want to go to Joseph. Oh, let me say one more thing on that. I agree with you that a lot hinges on how you interpret that event, Harry, but I've never thought that those negotiations were a ruse, and I still think that we're heading toward war. Not because I think these negotiations are a ruse, but just because the politics of this, I think, are very difficult for Trump if he's not willing to just like tell the Israel lobby, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to do this again. I mean, there are some other factors that make me think I'm wrong, that are making me less confident that a war is coming, namely the military situation. Like analysts all seem to agree that Iran is going to mount a much more ferocious retaliation. I mean, I've even heard from people who have like inside knowledge that Trump was trying to get some sort of choreographed replay of last year where he does this like strike on Iran, doesn't kill a whole lot of people, and then Iran does some sort of like token response just to say that they could do something. And Tehran does not want to play that game anymore because they feel it invites these like recurrent strikes by Trump because he wants to do, the quick, decisive, maybe not decisive, but the quick, strikes that get the headlines and seem like he had a victory, but without actually risking American casualties and so on. And so Iran now thinks we can't play that game anymore, right? We have to actually threaten to kill a lot of Americans, basically, because we do have soldiers in the Middle East and the ballistic missiles could kill them. Um, and so that's, I think, making Trump think twice. And also, we depleted so many of our interceptor missiles last year. Like 24% of our THAAD missiles were just gone on Israel's behalf. And that changes the calculation as well. Joseph, you tend to be, you know, less, maybe more critical of the U.S. Israel relationship than the average Republican, but probably significantly less so than the average like Zoomer conservative or American conservative staff writer. So I'm just kind of curious, how are you seeing this whole dynamic with Netanyahu visiting the White House yet again, and this whole Iran situation in light of your views on Israel that are maybe a little less critical?
I mean, I think it's very obvious that the Israelis are pushing for regime change in Tehran and, potentially regime collapse. They think they want the Ayatollah out, and they don't particularly care who, if anybody, replaces him. Um, there have been some efforts, to push sort of a, dismantling, balkanizing Iran. I think that's pretty clearly what the Israelis would like. They view Iran as the major competing regional hegemon and would like them to dissolve one way or the other. Uh, Obviously, I think that is probably not in the interests of the United States for a lot of reasons. I think that Trump is probably aware of that. I think that Trump is also aware that it would be very difficult to do the kind of limited strike that was done during the 12-Day War. That's one reason that I think that I'm somewhat more sanguine, perhaps, than you, Andrew. I just think that the politics of this, as domestically, are too big of the downside is too big for Trump to be willing to hand much over to the Israelis, Um, he's been very, very careful in any intervention that he's done so far to be very surgical, to limit the use of American forces and the potential downsides to American troops, and to generally to limit the sort of involvement that any campaign that he's undertaken would pull America into. And so I think it's very unlikely that he would allow for Israel to pull the United States into open war with Iran. That strikes me as very out of character. Trump is
Well, it's not.
perfectly
I mean, he
happy.
did it last year, but you just think that the stakes are higher now, or something.
I think I think they're definitely higher, and I think that Trump is pretty aware of that.
Yeah, I'll say one thing you hear in this town, and I've now heard it from multiple people. None of them had firsthand knowledge. They weren't like in the room having these conversations at like an official level, but they heard from people who were that Trump actually wanted to strike Iran like a month ago or whenever this was all really building up fast. And CENTCOM basically told him that's a very bad idea. Like, we don't have the military assets positioned where they need to be in order to, shield Israel and our own assets and our Arab partners in the region from retaliation. So we
Plus one
can't do
for
that.
intervention in America. The we've got an aircraft carrier group that we pulled out of the Middle East to go hit Venezuela instead.
Yeah, exactly. We're moving them back and forth. It's kind of funny to watch. I mean, darkly comical. And we have since then, since CENTCOM apparently, if this is true, told him no, we can't attack Iran now. We have ramped up our you know, military footprint in the Middle East. We've sent one aircraft carrier and its associated strike group. Now, Wall Street Journal is reporting today, I think, that we're about to deploy the USS. What is it, George Bush? That's an aircraft carrier and its own strike group that has a lot of offensive capability. All of this is consistent with we're about to strike Iran. Um, on the other hand, you can interpret that thing that I heard as Trump is getting some pretty good advice from like military officials who are concerned. And he's showing that he's not just acting in this like hubris from the Venezuela raid, because everyone seems to think he's like supremely confident in American military power at the moment, when actually he's aware of like downsides. Harry, I'm curious because I kind of interrupted you. Do you think that last year's negotiations were, at least in part, a ruse on Trump's part and on Netanyahu's part to kind of lull Iran into a false sense of security? And then what do you think that says, whatever your answer to that question is, about the current negotiations?
It's hard to tell, and I guess at different points in time over the past, like, since it's happened, I've probably believed different things based on the evidence that's been presented. I thought that the reporting that the Gray Zone has done on this topic has just been generally very reliable. They had a report. Um,
What did they say about it? They say it was a ruse?
I think that was their line, or maybe it was Drop Site News. I can't remember, but it was one of the independent left wing outlets, and you know, those have generally had some of the best coverage of both Iran and Gaza. Um, I think either way, the point that I've taken away from just everything during the second Trump term is that it's very difficult for the president to say no to Israel, and I haven't really seen him do it much. The only time I guess you could argue he said no was with imposing the ceasefire, although there was obviously a lot of domestic pressure within Israel to get that ceasefire too. And frankly,
But I think the
the
Trump pressure
ceasefire
was pretty decisive. Yeah.
okay, but there isn't really a ceasefire anyway. Like it doesn't exist, so the pressure didn't continue. Um, he's flaunting this board of peace as his own achievement and his administration's achievement, but just based on some people that I've talked to in DC, there are other partners in that coalition who do not view it as the success that he does, and of course not, because hundreds of people have been killed, including journalists and doctors, uh, ever since that ceasefire was put into place. Aid isn't getting into the Strip in the way that was promised, and UN agencies are still having trouble operating there. Um,
Yeah,
so
it's definitely, it's more of like a de-escalation agreement in effect, but I do think Trump, after Israel struck Doha, I think that really pissed Trump off, and that we saw him kind of put his foot down, do a little humiliating of Netanyahu publicly. But I agree, it's not the level of pressure that maybe some people on the anti-war right and anti-war left would hope for.
what I've been seeing now is that there are a lot of these what seem like the sorts of coordinated leaks that we got during the Biden administration. Now we're getting them from the Trump administration. In fact, the same people to Barack Ravid saying that I just saw one. Trump is frustrated with Netanyahu. This meeting that they just had at the White House, Trump was apparently frustrated with Netanyahu afterward. I mean, it's just very difficult to believe. Yeah, well, this was reported by Axios, but it's like it's tough to believe this stuff because, again, we continue to provide them with unlimited support, both financial and diplomatic. And even domestically, there is a point in the Trump administration to hammer out any criticism of Israel. So that's just been a priority of the Trump administration. And it's difficult to imagine Trump now saying no on Iran, knowing that, or on new strikes on Iran, knowing that Bibi Netanyahu will just continue to visit the United States and demand it and exert pressure, obviously out in the open, but who knows, maybe behind closed doors as well that we don't know about, other forms of pressure
Yeah.
on
Yeah,
Trump and on the administration to do it.
yeah, it's now clear based on reporting that all of these reports that we saw in the Biden administration, and it was pretty clear at the time, but now I think it's like indisputable. All these reports that anonymous officials, of course, say that the administration's frustrated with Netanyahu, that was just a media technique to kind of make the pressure from the left alleviate a little bit on Biden. But the Biden team was like really wanting to make sure that Israel got all of the weapons and support and stuff that it needed to continue its war in Gaza. What's interesting to me about the dynamic currently is that I agree, and I generally share your view, Harry, that I don't really trust Trump to say no to Netanyahu on something that Netanyahu, we have to emphasize, really, really, really wants a regime change in Iran. He's been pushing for this since like the late 90s, right? Since he became prime minister. Like he's tried to get every single president since then to bomb Iran, and he wasn't successful until Trump. And that tells you something. Like that's a reason for pessimism for people who don't want the U.S. to fight a war against Iran for Israel. At the same time, it could be that we're in a situation where Trump just can't choose anything else but to say no to Netanyahu because his military people are telling him like this is really bad. We're going to waste all of our military interceptors. Like we literally just can't do this in the kind of quick, decisive way that you want. Um, and if he does strike and Iran hits back, hard, and I think that the consensus is they will do that, to restore deterrence, as military analysts say. They will try to kill Americans, I think is the consensus, because they think that that's what's necessary to restore deterrence, and if that happens, we're just, like, in a new phase of Trump's political career because we haven't seen that. Like, we haven't seen how does Trump act when, like, a ship is sunk. Probably Iran couldn't sink one of our destroyers or aircraft carriers, certainly, but they might be able to, like, if they got lucky. The Houthis almost struck one last year, um, and we just got kind of lucky that the strike wasn't successful. Iran has much more impressive capabilities than the Houthis do. So if they were able to take out a major military asset and do real damage to one of our military installations in the Middle East and kill like dozens of soldiers, I think we'll see a side of Trump that we haven't seen before, and I'm not sure what that side would look like.
I think it would also be disastrous for him politically. Trump, has always sort of campaigned on restraint, will his inaugural speech, will be measured not by the wars, so but by the pieces that we make. Very rough paraphrase. So I
Yeah,
think that
not by the wars that we win, but by the wars that we end, and more importantly, the wars that we never get into. I think that's a
exactly,
closer.
yeah.
Mhm.
So I think that deliberately getting into any kind of war with Iran that has, anything basically more than what we got into last year with consequences, well, more severe than that, which would be almost nothing, I think would be absolutely disastrous to him politically, and it would completely sink the rest of his presidency.
Yeah, and I should say that point that I just made, it's not original to me. Trita Parsi, I don't think he would mind me naming him, told me that just a couple days ago when I ran into him in Budapest. Um, so yeah, I mean, we'll keep an eye on it. It's very difficult to predict. Um, but I will say I think on the politics of this, I can imagine that Trump is underestimating how difficult this would be politically for him, or like what the political consequences would be, because last year, Americans before the strikes were saying they didn't want them to happen, they didn't want the US to strike Iran, and then afterwards they kind of accommodated it. They changed their position a little bit. They said they were worried that the US would get too involved in Iran, but for the most part they were broadly supportive of the strikes themselves. And I don't think that that would be the same this time, because I think there's this perception that Trump is like out of control or something, because he's like what he did in Venezuela, and then he's like going after Greenland, and then if he does this again in Iran, I think Americans are starting to think, okay, this is too much. But Harry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I agree that Americans were supportive of the Iran strikes, and even conservatives, I don't think were. I mean, I wrote a piece on this where a group, I think it was IMEU, broke down the polling that was taken before and after the strikes, and it all depended on how the question was phrased. Of course, like if you ask people, especially Republicans, do you agree with President Trump's decision to strike Iran? Of course, like Republicans are going to support that. But when, they were asked in a different poll, I don't know if it was YouGov or CBS or someone, whether they just support the strikes on Iran, the answer was completely different. And so I think it all depends.
Yeah, there are framing effects, and it also, if you say strike Iran, you get lower approval than if you say strike nuclear facilities in Iran. Yeah,
And yeah, so I think that there was obviously like a coordinated effort to tailor it in a way that would make it seem like, all
But I
these
don't.
Americans
But what
putting
matters
more
is how
wars on Israel.
what matters is how Trump interpreted those polls. And the White House doesn't have this big culture of like downplaying American support for Trump's actions. Um, so I imagine he thought, okay, I got away with that. At some point his luck's gonna run out. Like the Venezuela op worked, the strike on Iran worked basically. Like it was quick. Like I wish it didn't happen because I think it kind of set a new baseline for American action and made future action more likely. And it didn't solve the underlying political dispute, but he kind of got away with it, and like he did major damage to Iran's nuclear facilities. At some point, there's going to be blowback. And I hope that people in the White House are telling the president that. I think we need to move on to Cuba. Another example of where Trump is kind of riding high and feeling like he had this amazing military operation in Venezuela, and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, is like the major Latin America hawk in the U.S. government. So he's also feeling his oats, and now they're setting their eyes on Cuba. So, Joseph, what exactly are they doing to Cuba, and what do they want to do to Cuba?
Yeah, so I mean, the Trump administration has explicitly said that they are interested in regime change in Cuba, and they are currently attempting to find somebody in the Cuban government who can essentially act as the Delcy Rodriguez of Cuba, so that, if they go through and do some kind of operation in Cuba, then, or if there is some kind of external force that sort of topples the government in some way, that they will have somebody to run Cuba as as an American proxy. Right now, that person that they are looking at is principally the heir of Castro's son. Um,
Really? Wow. I thought that there wasn't such a person in Cuba, and I didn't expect that it would be Castro's son.
well, it is a Castro. It's not Fidel Castro's son.
Yeah, it's the right. It's It's the other Castro, who is also not the leader now, but he's still alive, right? He's, like, in his 90s?
Raúl Castro, yes.
Mhm.
Um,
And who's the current leader? Who is the current leader?
Diaz Canel.
What's his deal? Is he popular? Is he
He's
competent at
popular
all?
in the party, and that is what matters.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, he's done a good job of holding the government together under difficult circumstances, but I mean, competent would be a difficult word to describe the regime in Cuba. It's very good at maintaining order, not so good at, you know, making sure that the lights are staying on and that their power grid is stable.
Well,
Currently,
it's hard when you're 90 miles from the world's superpower and it's been strangling you since the 1960s.
Yeah, how are they supposed to, like, do that? It's just
currently the Cuban economy is suffering terribly. The entire island is subject to rolling blackouts. About the average citizen in Cuba has no power the majority of the time. So they were barely propped up by oil shipments to the country from Venezuela and from Mexico. Mostly from Mexico, although Venezuela did contribute significantly. About a third of their oil imports came from Venezuela. And reportedly, that's one of the reasons that the United States pursued Venezuela so hard, is because it was viewed sort of as a gateway to Cuban regime change. So now that the United States obviously has seized control of Venezuela's oil, all the oil imports to Cuba have stopped. And a few weeks ago, then the United States put in place a new secondary sanctions regime on Cuba uh, by means of tariffs. So now the U.S. is going to be placing tariffs on anybody who directly or indirectly supplies oil to Cuba. And so the major impact that has had is it has cut off the oil imports from Mexico, which made up the majority of Cuban oil
And
imports.
that was it like does Cuba even have money to pay for Mexican oil? Like how are they even getting it?
No, essentially, so Cuba is an extremely cash poor country. It received a little bit of cash inflow. Its principal source of cash flow was from tourism. When the Obama administration sort of opened up to more towards Cuba, that has since been cut off. So the Cuban economy is very cash poor. That's why they were turning around and reselling a lot of the Venezuelan oil that they were getting to mostly China. Um, but because they needed cash to import things like military equipment. Uh, so they're extremely cash poor. They do not have the reserves to buy for any significant period of time oil on the open market. And nobody would want to sell it to them because nobody wants to get smacked by American tariffs.
Yeah.
So
I'll
the
I'll go to
Mexicans,
Harry in a bit, but I'm just curious, like, what does Cuba have? Like, how they have doctors, right? Weren't they doing some, like they send their doctors to Mexico or something?
yeah, the Cuban state has two principal resources. Well, it has tourism, and then it has two principal resources after that. It has its healthcare system, which trains doctors and then sends them abroad to do healthcare work. In many cases, sort of they do this in return for in-kind donations. So there were a lot of Cuban doctors in Venezuela, and that was part of the reason that Venezuela would send oil back to Cuba, sort of as payment. The other asset that they have is their intelligence services, which is in many cases combined with their healthcare services. So the doctors will also be spies. And again, they're often very involved in the oil trade. The Cuban intelligence services were who, as we know, made up Maduro's bodyguards, um, which is why you got the very touching scene of the Cubans marching back with the remains of Maduro's bodyguards in the tiny caskets
You
after
said
we.
touching scene, it was a pretty disturbing scene. Why were those caskets so tiny? I mean, it was are those body parts? Were they cremated?
I
It was like a little
assumed that
box.
they
They were
were
like it's like,
cremated.
"We're
Yeah.
going to parade through with the remains of our dead security service members," and they're holding these, like, tiny boxes, you know? Um, I don't know. Harry, I wanna go to you. What do you think about this whole thing about Trump's, policy toward Cuba and maybe US policy toward Cuba, ever since, the communist revolution there?
I think it's so stupid, honestly. It's about a number of things. And first of all, it's a deep state project. It's that's why it's persisted over various administrations, Republican or Democrat, regardless of who's in the executive office, that we've been sanctioning Cuba and trying to do regime change there effectively through uh, sanctions. I mean, you could say that now it's more an official overt policy, publicly announced of regime change, but pretty much every administration, you could say maybe with the exception of the Obama administration, was incredibly hostile to that country. And it goes back to, as you said, the Cuban Revolution. What they did was they kicked out the CIA and they kicked out organized crime like Meyer Lansky and all the syndicates, the criminal syndicates who were basically trading heroin. That's what they were doing. They were getting it from Southeast Asia and bringing it into the United States. And they would use the casinos in Havana to wash all this money. And so, of course, when Castro came into power, he didn't like that and he kicked them all out. And there's been this obsession between, you know, the CIA and just different organized crime groups in the United States with removing the leadership of Cuba ever since. And of course, like there's all sorts of ideological reasons, they're a communist regime or they're repressive. I mean, the fact is, and I've talked about this many times, like we don't care about whether or not a country is repressive or not. I mean, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, these are some of our, greatest allies. They're some of the most repressive countries in the world. So we don't care about that. Um, it's it's kind of pointlessly cruel what we're doing to Cuba now. I mean, as Joseph said, they don't really have a lot of electricity or food or resources generally. Um, the people who live there now obviously have no connection to what happened 70 years ago, even if you like hate communism or whatever. Um, so
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
it's
Raul
interesting, like
Castro's still there, but he's like 90 years old.
yeah, maybe that's an underestimate. It's interesting. I don't think this is the main factor, but the US really can hold a grudge, you know. And I think that's part of this. Like Cuba, we were backing their dictator Batista, right? And that's who the Cuban Revolution overthrew. And that kind of thing just really continues to inform U.S. strategic planning. Seemingly, like you still hear about the Iranian hostage crisis, like so many decades later, when people are justifying our like hostility to Iran, even though that crisis has been really misrepresented and exaggerated. Um, in terms of like what were the driving forces of it. But and I again, I don't think that this is the main thing, but I think that the U.S. really doesn't like when a small country, thumbs its nose at the United States. Like we do not want that to happen, and we will continue to like strangle that country until we get a new regime to sort of make the grudge go away. But Joseph, just what does like the optimal version from Trump's own perspective and from Rubio's perspective, what is like the best case scenario for this policy? What does Cuba look like plausibly after they do a regime change and it works? And then conversely, with Iran, we can imagine some significant blowback that's bad for US interests. It's a little harder to imagine that in the case of Cuba, but what is the worst case scenario if things go wrong?
Sure. So obviously what the Trump administration wants to do is it wants a high impact policy with the lowest risk possible. That's why they're looking at Raul Castro's son. He he is integrated with the military. He's served in the Cuban intelligence services, so he knows all the power centers in Cuba. He's capable of maintaining the regime as it exists, so you don't have to worry about state collapse or military occupation or anything messy and potentially dangerous like that. The ideal situation, what the Trump administration is hoping for, I imagine, is that sort of by economically strangling Cuba, by cutting off the last of their oil, the last of their sort of uh, economic lifelines and subsidies, then they can cause a collapse in the Cuban economy so total that there is some kind of collapse within the government that leads to the emergence of a new regime that can be then backed by the United States and that can be negotiated with and essentially puppeted. And that the United States can then do the exact same thing with Cuba that it's currently doing with Venezuela, where it sort of co-opts the Delcy Rodriguez government and uses it as its proxy to bring about the changes in that country's foreign and mostly foreign policy, but also somewhat in its domestic policy to make it more
So what,
favorable.
like relationships with its relations with China, or what's the foreign policy thing?
Yeah, I mean, principally it is to control Cuban foreign policy. But that has always been essentially the goal of the United States when it comes to Cuba. Even when we had liberated it immediately from the Spanish Empire, the principle we put in their constitution that the United States can essentially have a veto over all of Cuba's foreign policy. That has always been the United States' policy with regard to Cuba, and it makes sense when you look at the things like the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are some legitimate national security risks to having a hostile regime that's not far from your borders. So that's what the Trump administration would like to happen. Will that actually happen? Very doubtful. Uh, we've just learned over and over and over again that these kind of economic sanctions do not work. You cannot collapse governments by simply impoverishing them. The
I don't know if that's true. I used to say that, but I think that the foreign policy elite in America has drawn a very different lesson from like the collapse in Syria, and also what's going on in Iran, where our sanctions have directly led to the situation of like mass protests
No,
in Iran.
but again, it's supposed to
but
have a
it's
political outcome. That's an economic outcome. You're saying
well,
that they're
Sure, but
they're
Assad fell. Assad fell, and that was the goal. Like
okay,
that's what
but
but
Israel
that
wanted.
was
that
also
was
because the
not the
CIA
result of
supported.
sanctions. That was the result of the Turkish-sponsored and trained militia
Well,
marching in and
The
collapsing.
yeah,
sanctions had a
and
lot to do with it, I think.
I think
It
it was
really did.
also because the CIA was launching and they had a dirty war there for at least a decade, supporting various terrorist groups against the Assad government, and so yeah, like that obviously helped to weaken Syria, but I don't think that you could say that that was all the sanctions. Just like in Iran now, like, sure, there were protests, but what did they do? I mean, even the Israel Firsters at Foundation for Defense of Democracy, they're arguing right now that Iran is more emboldened than ever, that they're more aggressive than ever, that they're looking to increase their ballistic missile capacity. So,
But they've
not the
also been,
political
like,
outcome.
substantially weakened, you know?
Right,
Sanctions
that
Like,
can
their
their
economy
ability
is.
to fund, their militant partners in the region. I'm not saying I support sanctions because, like, the problem with sanctions is that the ruling class can generally sustain their lavish lifestyle while the population becomes immiserated. But one thing that's kind of interesting to me about the Trump administration is its officials, people like Scott Bessent most notably, they actually just say what the actual point of sanctions is. It's to immiserate the people so that the support for the regime goes down. And by that metric, I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just saying, looking at this from the perspective of people in the foreign policy establishment, it does seem like the sanctions work in that regard. Like Maduro was very unpopular, and one reason that this operation in Venezuela basically worked is because a lot of Venezuelans were happy to see him go, and one reason they're happy to see him go is because the sanctions on Venezuela just made it impossible for him to deliver like public services and stuff, right? And the same situation in Iran, like that regime is much less popular than it would be absent sanctions, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the case. It's very hard to tell the public opinion in Iran right now. I mean, there are all those marches. They were claimed to be anti government. They were supposedly a lot of people in pro government protest rallying around their government under U.S. siege too. So it's hard to tell. And I think again, it's important to make a distinction between this economic consequence of collapsing their economy, which yes, people like Besant, openly admit amazingly that that is what the sanctions are designed to do, and the political outcome of weakening, or not just weakening Iran, but having a change in their behavior in the region, which it is not.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely. Yeah, I don't think I disagree with you, but I do think that the foreign policy elites would disagree with you, and they would point to these examples that I've shown. I want to go to Epstein, but Joseph, do you have any last words on Cuba? What could go wrong, or anything else?
Well, allow me to finish what I had been saying. Sanctions can weaken. Sanctions can weaken governments. Like there's no question about that. But sanctions do not produce regime change by themselves, because authoritarian regimes are very good at adapting their power structures. So yes, it makes them easier. It makes it easier for you to go in and intervene, but you still have to have an intervention. Like somebody still has to push the domino over. And that always entails risks for whoever chooses to do it. So that's why I was saying I very much doubt that the Trump administration is going to get what it wants just by choking off Cuba's oil supplies, because there's no there you can say, well, it will collapse support for the regime. Support for the Cuban regime has always been very low. It's not like there's a massive base of people who are super loyal to the Cuban Communist Party. Um, Tons of the population of Cuba has fled, and the Cuban regime makes it very easy. If if you really really hate Cuban communism, you just leave and go to Florida.
But how do
Um,
they like get taxes? How do they pay these security services? Isn't that threatened now? Like,
they have a big bank saved up of uh they have US. This is one of the reasons they would turn around and resell that oil, is they have American dollars saved up specifically for their security services. This is like the one big expense of the Cuban government. Like when you're an authoritarian regime, you use what resources you have to pay your military and pay your security services.
is that why the White House is making the dollar devaluate at a rapid rate? Maybe that's part of this too.
I mean,
Um,
potentially. So yeah, I think that if the United States wants regime change in Cuba, they will have to go in and do something about it. Which is why I said I don't think it would be surprising if the United States tries to do something like what they did to Maduro in Cuba. Um, and that could potentially have bad consequences. The United States, of course, is much more competent, much richer, etc. All the qualifications, but Cuba has historically been a much bigger thorn in the side of the United States than the United States has always assumed that it would be.
Yeah, I mean, they were trying to kill. It's amazing that they were never able to kill Fidel Castro, given all of their attempts. Harry, I want to go to Epstein now. So there was this big, the I guess the Justice Department was forced by law to release all these Epstein files. I think they still haven't released millions, but we did get what, like 6 million or something, various
Something like that,
documents.
yeah.
So one thing that's interesting to me is I'm seeing a lot of people. I think that there's kind of a faction of conservatives, at least conservatives who are active on Twitter, who have become more skeptical of the Epstein story. And I think actually the independent journalist Michael Tracy has played a big role in getting people to become more skeptical. He says that he thinks that like 90% of all the fuss about Epstein is basically based on like moral panic and exaggeration and misinterpretation. Um, so I'm just kind of curious, these files, do they corroborate those who have been saying, that there was this massive ring of elites who were like sex trafficking minors and that Epstein was probably working for Mossad and maybe other intelligence services? Or do they kind of vindicate the Michael Tracy's of the world or something in between? What do you think?
It's very interesting. If you remember, and I just watched this again yesterday, I think it was uh, James O'Keefe or someone else who uncovered this. It was Pam Bondi, the attorney general, maybe 10 months ago. And she was recorded saying, "Oh, we have thousands or tens of thousands of videos of, basically child pornography that Epstein maintained." Uh,
That he made or that he just like downloaded on the internet?
it I don't really remember, but it sounded like it was videos with him and just with children, um, and that this would all be revealed. We were told, of course, by, uh, I think it was Kash Patel, that there were more conspirators, and none of this, like, came out. We didn't see any of this. So I think to the question of whether or not Epstein was operating some, like, massive child sex ring, I haven't seen the evidence for that yet. Maybe that exists somewhere, as Pam Bondi claimed that it did. But I have not seen that yet in the files. What is revealed is that, yeah, people like Bill Gates and a lot of powerful people would go to Epstein, and Epstein would show up at different events with like 20 young women. And that was like his thing. And that's why powerful people wanted to be around him, was because, or at least one reason was because he brought a lot of young women with him. Whether or not Uh, all of them were underage. I don't think that's true, or at least there's evidence that that's not the case. So I think Tracy has, um, good points when it comes to that stuff. He was also correct, uh, and I agreed with him at the time, for TAC, when I was writing about the Epstein files in November, that the Epstein Files Transparency Act created these loopholes for Pam Bondi and the Justice Department to redact beyond just victims. And of course, I said, and Tracy too, that this would be abused, to redact other people.
Don't isn't there aren't Didn't they say they're going to literally redact every single female? I use that term because women and girls, faces and names. Like literally, if you're a woman, you're gonna be redacted and your identity is not gonna be revealed as being present in the files.
I mean, they went well beyond that. They redacted, as Thomas Massey revealed, Les Wexner out of the files. And he was listed in an FBI document from 2019, which by no means that he's guilty. But he was listed in a 2019 document accusing him, the FBI accusing him of child sex crimes, and or as at least as a co-conspirator in those crimes with Epstein, and he was redacted out of it, his name and photo. And the question is, what interest does the Trump Justice Department have in redacting this Zionist billionaire from Ohio, who's seemingly retired, you know, from public life? Like, what interest do they have in removing him from the files? And there's other cases like that too. And so,
And he was connected to Epstein in terms like Epstein was managing his money and had access to his assets and stuff.
yeah, that's what it looks like. If you follow the paper trail, which is kind of minimal at the moment, which is another thing I think is so surprising. Um, maybe other researchers have found a better money trail than I have, but uh, it's difficult to find, just what exactly the source of Epstein's wealth is. There's a ton of wire transfers between him and people like David Ellison, and obviously this business relationship or business relationships that Epstein maintained with figures like Ehud Barak and Les Wexner and Leon Black has been well documented for a long time, and it's all been confirmed by these files too. I would say that what was really validated, though, by all these files is Epstein's connections to the Israeli government and the Israeli security state. Because all the emails, for instance, that Dropsite News had reported on and that we reported on for TAC in December, they were all there and then some, talking about Epstein's relationship with that foreign government, how he organized various security contracts in places like Mongolia, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Africa, on behalf of that foreign government. Um,
Although that's interesting because Netanyahu he's like leaning into the Epstein discourse right now, and he's done this before because Ehud Barak, that was the main Israeli associate, former prime minister, main associate of Epstein as far as the Israelis are concerned, and that he was a political rival of Netanyahu, and so Netanyahu is trying to say, oh, Epstein was in cahoots with Barack, and I had nothing to do with it. And Epstein was actually supporting this like anti-Netanyahu faction within the Israeli government. But I oppose that entirely. What do you make of that kind of rhetoric from Bibi?
Yeah, I think this started in like 2019 too, where Bibi Netanyahu, as soon as there was a lot of publicity over Netanyahu's death, he started accusing Ehud Barak of being in league with Jeffrey Epstein. And this goes back many years that he was tweeting about this publicly. And so I think that maybe for domestic Israeli politics, that's useful for Netanyahu. It does seem like Epstein operated as part of a network that included Amman, which is Israeli military intelligence, which doesn't necessarily involve Netanyahu. That was under Ehud Barak's purview for a long time as their defense minister and also as a previous prime minister of that country. And so I really don't know what to make of that. It could also just be Netanyahu kind of flexing like his control and just like the number of assets I would say that Israel has deployed abroad. It's well known that Jeffrey Epstein was at the very least an Israel lobbyist and a very devoted one, working with Les Wexner against people like John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt when they wrote the Israel lobby and published it in the London Review of Books. This was all reported by Dropsite News. His donations to groups like Friends of Israel and various Jewish settlement projects in the West Bank are also documented in the new files. Um, and just the circles that he ran in. There were a lot of, I mean, there's no other way to put it. They're Zionist Jewish billionaires was mostly the people that Epstein was hanging out with. Um, they were going back to the 1990s, of course. It was reported that Epstein and Wexner and a bunch of other Jewish billionaires, like the Bronfman family, they organized this thing called the Mega Group, which funded things like Birthright on behalf of Israel and did Israeli PR, just kind of a centerpiece of the Israel lobby. And so this is something that Epstein has known to have been involved with for decades, Israel-based advocacy in the United States. And we just saw more of that in these files.
Yeah, it's also these files have caused a fair amount of chaos in the British government, somewhat unexpectedly. Peter Mandelson was appointed by Keir Starmer to be ambassador to the US, despite Starmer knowing about his connections to Epstein. And, now Starmer is having to apologize for having appointed him. Starmer's chief of staff had to, quote unquote, resign for giving bad advice about the appointment of Mandelson. Mandelson vacated the House of Lords. He retired from the Labor Party. So this has been like a huge stain on his legacy and reputation. And we've seen, in I can't remember the all the specific examples now, but we've seen a lot of European governments and business leaders and stuff. Um, having to fire people and apologize for connections to Jeffrey Epstein. Maybe I think it's fair to say we've seen more accountability in Europe than in the United States on this. Um,
Yeah, it depends. Like, for instance, Catherine Rumler, I think everything's fine with her. She hasn't been reprimanded at all. She's, I think, general counsel for Goldman Sachs. She worked in the Obama administration. It was revealed in these emails that she was almost like a best friend to Jeffrey Epstein, that he almost mentored her. Um, she was also, it was revealed, awarded a CIA award, which, to my knowledge, um, civilians don't really get. So it seems like she is some sort of NOC knock CIA asset. The former Obama administration official, Catherine Rumler. But there are some people who have gotten in trouble, like Larry Summers is obviously in a ton of trouble.
well, the Harvard like student newspaper is going hard at him.
Yeah. Uh, Brad Karp is another one who's or was the chairman of Paul Weiss, which is like a major big law firm. Um, he was actually, I think, the chairman of the board of trustees of the college that I attended. He had to resign from that too. So people are getting in trouble in some circles. And to the Michael Tracy point, yeah, there are some people who it looks like are getting in trouble just for their association with him, which is obviously something that shouldn't necessarily happen. If someone is involved in criminal activity, or, you know, just something that's on its face immoral, they should obviously be punished for it. But
Although I think in the Mandelson case, and he probably wasn't involved in any, sexual indiscretions in relation to Epstein because Peter Mandelson is gay, and I don't think that there's been reports of like young underage boys that Epstein is trafficking. But Mandelson was like giving him very sensitive information. Like he tipped him off to this coming EU bailout of Greece. He also, for some reason, told him about this underground tunnel connecting the prime minister's residence to the Ministry of Defense, which sounds like the kind of thing that a government official is not supposed to reveal to outsiders.
it looked like they were passing intelligence. Yeah, it seemed like that. And if you look at some of Epstein's other emails, he tells like Peter Thiel, for instance, I represent the Rothschilds. That's who I represent, the banking
Although
family.
this kind of thing, this is where I think there's a tendency for people to exaggerate because one thing that's become clear about Epstein is he was like a serial fabulist who constantly exaggerated his own connections. He was able to form an incredible amount of connections with very wealthy and powerful people by constantly presenting himself as someone who knows everybody and can connect to everyone. He's best friends with this person, best friends with that person, and I think he had a tendency to. He basically lied often, which makes it. I don't think that that means that there's no there or that the Michael Tracy perspective is completely right. I actually don't think that that's true. I don't agree with Michael Tracy that 90% of this is exaggerated, but it does mean you have to like come to this with a critical eye when you're reading these emails.
So,
Joseph, give
yeah, like even on the Rothschild connection, that's documented beyond that one email. Dropside News uh, did reporting in November showing that, yeah, there was a business relationship there, and he was one of their representatives for that bank. And so that's just known. And of course, a bank, a major financial institution, would want access to classified government information, not just because, of course, the Rothschilds are a famous Zionist family with all sorts of interests in Israel, even donating the Knesset building and their Supreme Court building that they have in that country, who would, of course, are Israel lobbyists in various countries, not just for that reason, but because they're a bank and they trade on private information and it's useful for them. They can profit from it. So, of course, Epstein is a guy who fills those sorts of roles in elite circles, not exclusively for intelligence, but for different corporations. That's why I think he was close to people like Jess Staley at Barclays and other financial institutions.
He was remarkably similar to Robert Maxwell in this respect. This kind of one-man intelligence service and broker of, like, powerful forces. Robert Maxwell being Ghislaine, Maxwell's father. Ghislaine Maxwell was Jeffrey Epstein's longtime confidant and sort of girlfriend for a while. Um, Joseph, just take us home here. How do you see this whole Epstein thing, and have you been keeping track of this latest document dump?
I mean, I've sort of very vaguely aware of it. Um, but in general, I think sort of in many ways, obviously, like there are a lot of fishy things that are going on with Epstein, and there's a lot of investigation that needs to be done. The problem with sort of the document dump for the public is that uh, there's a lot of people who just have no idea what they're doing. Like they think that being mentioned in the Epstein files means you're a pedophile or something. And there's just a lot of people who are just like mentioned by Jeffrey Epstein in the Epstein files as somebody that he like who wrote an article that he was talking about with one of his friends and things like that. So there are a lot of people who are freaking out about all kinds of things in the Epstein files because they just don't understand sort of how this thing how what the Epstein files actually are and what they mean. So that's sort of one caution when approaching this conversation is there are a lot of people who are going to be in the Epstein files who have no relationship with Epstein whatsoever, and there are a lot of people who are freaking out and making a big deal out of something that they don't understand. So two sides of the coin there.
Even some people who met with him, like Bill Burns, I think was he maybe alongside Peter Thiel? I could be wrong about that, but Bill Burns met with he was the former CIA director for Biden, and he was a longtime diplomat, ambassador to Russia, for example. He met with Epstein, and I remember being very, kinda disgusted when I first learned about that connection, but then I've since come to believe that Burns didn't do anything really, like, maybe his name shouldn't be sullied for all time. Um, it seems like Epstein established himself in elite circles as someone that you gotta meet with this guy, you know? I find that itself kind of bewildering because, everyone talks about how Epstein is, like, charismatic and, like, some sort of math genius or something, or at least people used to say that about him. I've seen very little evidence of that, you know? So
You listen to his
it's
videos, like he doesn't sound like a particularly charismatic guy.
yeah, and then this Bannon, this video where he's talking to Bannon, he doesn't sound very smart when he's talking about philosophy, you know?
Okay, watch that video. What he says, and this is why, again, I think there's more stuff here. Obviously, there's more that hasn't been released. It really does seem based on, and I would just say just based on the circumstantial evidence, which is who Epstein was surrounding himself with, particularly at the time of Iran Contra, that Epstein's role was as this money launderer. And of course, there are organizations like the CIA or various intelligence services who operate not just off of black budgets, but they need ways to wash money. That's just what they do. It's not just criminal enterprises who wash money, but the CIA. And Epstein seems kind of like the exact target person who you would go to for that. That seems more or less like what his role was. And obviously, there's some speculation mixed in with that, like assessment, but that's just what I think a lot of people have determined at this point. And yeah,
And it does seem like he had the financial skills to do that, especially because the CIA, presumably in that circumstance, would be kinda telling him what to do exactly. And he does have experience in the financial services.
right. And so when he did his Bannon interview, and they're asking him like, "Oh, well, why? What made you so famous? What made all these people at the heights of power, the Rockefellers, the Trilateral Commission? They're talking about why were you invited to join it?" And he said, "Oh, well, it's because I always carried around a Texas Instrument calculator," he says. No one else on Wall Street in the 1980s was carrying around a calculator, just Jeffrey Epstein. And so all these famous people and financial elites wanted to meet him and bring him around. He was just so good with it, his Texas Instrument calculator. And it's just not credible. It's the type of story that, like, your grandpa will tell you, like, or just a very, like, elderly person, and you could just tell, like, it's not really the truth. So again, I think there's more things going on there that we just don't know about, and, of course, there will be, journalists like Michael Tracy, who, by the way, is a good journalist, and he's right to be skeptical of everything, as everyone should be. The fact is that there's just plenty of evidence at this point that Epstein was more than just some guy, that he had these connections to various foreign governments, mainly Israel, and their intelligence service, Amman, to Ehud Barak, that he was a major Israel lobbyist, and that a lot of his activities were on behalf of this foreign government in the United States. Whether or not those sex crimes were related to it, which of course I mean, he signed that deal, that plea deal in 2007, and they had a number of, I think, over 40 victims who they could have gone to. You know, you can dispute which of those are real and which are fake, whatever. Um, there's obviously more to the story that we're not learning.
Yeah, and it definitely seems like we have learned from these files that there are a lot of elites who are downplaying, minimizing deceptively their connections to Epstein or the amount of times that they met with him. I mean, Howard Lutnick, Elon Musk, Peter Mandelson all seem to fit this bill. Elon Musk is like, he's presenting these files as some sort of vindication, or like he's really aggressively attacking people who are in the files, but he's like in the emails telling Epstein, "I want to party hard this weekend at your island," you know? Um, I don't know exactly what was going on there, or if I don't even know if he actually went to the island, but the emails suggest, he hasn't been completely forthcoming, and it's interesting because you remember when he left the White House, he said that Trump is in the Epstein files, and that's why they won't be released. Oh, I'll say maybe just to end, as far as how this affects Trump, it it doesn't it kinda make him look good? Isn't there an email about how Trump, or not an email, but there one of the files suggests that Trump was saying Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell are creepy and the FBI needs to look into them. This was, like, way back in the 2000s.
Yeah, but there's also an email, like, from Melania, it looks like, where she's like, "Oh, we had such a great time with you guys this weekend, and we'll see you
Well, how
soon," or
when was that? Because 'Cause he's been married to
2002.
Melania for a while.
It was,
Yeah.
2002, yeah, and,
That was, that's public record
yeah,
admitted by Trump that he was friends with him back then.
right. I I guess um, what makes what makes it look bad for the Trump administration is not necessarily the mentions of Trump in the files, but just the fact that they continue to go to great lengths to redact various people who are just not victims and who are obviously in the public interest out of these files so that people in the public cannot view them. And it's become almost a meme at this point. The just how many people are redacted, and just the number of black Sharpie lines all throughout these documents that have been released. So uh, I think that's where it looks bad for
Yeah,
the Trump
and
administration.
interestingly, Thomas Massie, who's, like, kind of led the charge along with Ro Khanna and the House of Representatives to get these files released, he's always said that Trump is trying to protect Trump's friends, like billionaire friends and maybe the Saudis and stuff, from embarrassing revelations, and that framing's interesting because I think Massie would say Trump is protecting himself if that's what Massie believed to be the case. Um, so that's kind of interesting context. I think that brings us though to the end of this conversation. We didn't get to AI. I guess it's a tradition on this podcast that we don't get to every single topic that I tease at the beginning. So apologies to our audience for that. I want to thank them for listening until the end, and I want to thank you, Joseph, and you, Harry, for the illuminating discussion. See you next time.